A lot of Node-RED projects are built around the fact that you need to move information from one data source to another data source. It might be a user interface, or one of the most commonly used and most useful data sources, a database. In this video in particular, I'll be taking a look at the MySQL database nodes for Node-RED and how to use them to insert data into a database as well as read it back. In a previous video, I went over how to install this node package, how to get the basic configuration done, and how to insert just one piece of data from one data source, like a button press that only inserts when the button is pressed, or a temperature gauge which is logged over time. In this video, instead of using just one piece of data, I'll be collecting multiple pieces of data, and I'll do this in two different ways and then show you guys how to read it back. So let's get started. Firstly, I will be using the same developer database that I used last time and the same local server, but this would work for a cloud server or something else on premise as well. Instead of using this management table within that database, however, we're going to be entering purchases in this convenience store example. I will be reading in a fuel level and then simulating fuel purchases, and I'll also be reading in different product information and storing that in the same C-store table. Instead of starting with this fuel level, we'll actually be starting with just really basic information. We want to put in a product name, a product quantity, a product price, and then finally we'll have a customer name. This will all be triggered by a button press, and I'm going to be using the Node-RED dashboard user interface to do all of this. You can install the Node-RED dashboard UI yourself, and we've also got a video that goes over that, and we'll go into a more advanced table node that we can also install later on in the video. So the first thing we need to do is understand our database so we know exactly what we need to collect. Let's do a quick insert statement now. I'll start by just dragging in an inject node, and then I'll push and hold left control and left click on my workspace so that I can quickly search for and add in a MySQL node. This has already been configured with that developer database that I mentioned earlier, so I can just click done there and wire this in. Now I just need to make a request to get that list of tables, so I'll come over to my timestamp and I'll inject that question into the topic, since if I select the developer nodes and come over to the help tab, you can see that message.topic must hold the query. So let's go ahead and set our message.topic to be show tables. I'll end this with a semicolon, as with all transact SQL commands. You'll see that more throughout the video. Now I just need to read this back, so I'll also drag in a debug node. And I do need to be watching message.payload, since the result is returned in message.payload, and message.topic again holds that input command, that select statement. So with that done, I'll just hit deploy, inject, and we can see here my two tables. I have my C-store table and I have my management table. So let's take a deeper look at this C-store table. I'll again come over to my inject and I'll switch my command to instead describe C-store. You can see that I've put my commands in all caps so that I can differentiate them from table names and column names like I am here with C-store. This isn't necessary, but it can help make your commands a little bit more readable, especially if you have multiple people working on this same project. With that changed, I'll click done, deploy, and we'll inject once more. Now we can see I get a description of all of the different columns in that table. I'll scroll down so that we can see all of it, and we start with our ID. This just identifies the entry in the table and will actually auto increment. So the first entry will be entry 1, entry 2, and so on. Because it's automatic, I don't actually need to include this, so I'll collapse it. The others, however, I will need to inject. I have an integer that's going to be my date timestamp. I also have the product name, and these are characters, so I will need to specify that it's a string with single quotes, whereas quantity is a floating point number, so I just put that raw data in without any quotes. Finally, I also have the price, which is another float, and we'll end with another string, this varchar, or variable character customer. So here are the 5 different pieces of data I'm going to put in, 4 of which I'll be able to fully control with my user interface. So let's put each of these interface objects in. I'll scroll down to the bottom so we can see what I have available to me. Now I will be generating the date automatically within code, but I will be entering the product, quantity, price, and customer a little bit more manually. So let's skip over the date for now and start with the product. Because this is a text input, we want to put in the name of the product, I'll drag in a text input node. Here you can see right away I already have a fuel group and a other store items group that I already created. If you don't know how these groups are created or what they look like, go ahead and watch our previous video that goes over a more basic introduction to the Node-RED dashboard. For now, I'll just select this other store items group, and I do want to change the size so that it's a bit more wide. I want it to be a size of 8, but no longer. Next, I'll give this a label, and that label will be the product name. And we'll just handle it as normal text input. Now this is going to come out on message.payload, and we can see that under the help tab here. Any message is sent as message.payload. So we'll just click done, and now we need to save that message.payload. In order to do that, I'm going to be using a change node, and I'll save the variables within this flow of Node-RED. So to do that, I'll press and hold left control and left click on the workspace to quickly drop in this change node, and I'll wire it in. Here though, instead of setting message.payload, I'll select this dropdown and choose flow. Flow context means that anywhere in this flow, if I refer to, for example, flow.product, I'll get whatever was outputted most recently by this node. I could also save it globally so that I could also read it from the other tabs, for example the management, the C-store, or even other tabs. It's global to the whole project. I'll just use the flow right here. This flow.product is going to hold the message.payload. So now I'm setting this new flow variable, and I'm saving the message.payload inside of it. So I'll just click done, and that's my first one, already done. I've saved it. Let's move on to the next bit. So I'll select the debug pane, and we'll see that my next one after product is the quantity. You can see that this quantity is actually going to be a float. And the reason it's a float, not an integer, is you could, for example, buy half a gallon of fuel, which is going to be another product that we'll look at. So we do need to make sure this is a floating point number. Let's drag that in right away. I will use a numeric scroller for this because when it comes to just buying an item, it can be an integer, but when we go to store it, it must be allowed to be a float. So now that I've dragged in the numeric input, let's change that as well. Instead of the label just being numeric, we'll label it as quantity. Now, all we have to do is leave that input as the input, and let's say they'll be able to buy up to 100 different products. That's all of that handled except for the size, which I'll set to be 4. The only other change we will need to make here is instead of it being in the fuel checkout preview group, we'll put it in the other store items group so that they're all in the right place. So with that done, I'll click done, and we'll do the same trick here we did with the change node. I can even select it, press Ctrl-C, and then press Ctrl-V to get a copy and wire that in. But instead of overriding the flow.product that we're already getting from the product name, I want to be setting it separately. So I'll be setting it to flow.quantity, and that'll be able to save it without overriding my current product. With both of those set up, let's test this out to make sure it's all working as expected. I'll click deploy, and I'll come over to this little dashboard tab up in the top right here. If you don't have this, it may be because you haven't installed the dashboard UI package. You'll need to do that first. So I'll select the dashboard there, and select this little box with the arrow coming out of it to open my dashboard in a new tab. You can see that brought me to rio-dev, that's my hostname, /node-red/UI with a trailing slash there. And then the rest of it is just this particular page that's rendered. So now we can see here I have the quantity of products, and I can increase or decrease that however I want. And I can also enter a product name like snacks, and I'll be able to check out with snacks in a moment. So when it comes to entering the price, I want to be using this product name style of field entry so that I can type in the exact number of cents that the product costs, whether there's the quantity only goes up and down by those single increments. So back in Node-RED, I do want to bring in another text input field, but we will need to modify the value that comes out of it to make sure we save it as a number and not as a text input. So I'll start by double clicking it, make sure we're in the other store items group, and I'll change the size to something like 6. So now I just need to set the label, and in this case we are bringing in that price right there, so we'll just enter price, and we'll see we're in text input mode. So now I do want to output this value, and we will copy and paste that flow change node as well. When I wire this in, I will need to make some other changes before I deploy though. Instead of just setting flow.quantity to be this message.payload, which is currently a string that holds a number, we want to convert that value into an actual number data type. Now, there's a lot of ways we can turn message.payload from a string data type that's coming out of this text input field into an actual number data type. We could bring in a function node or one of many other nodes, but there's actually a really nifty way to do that directly in the change node. Here, instead of simply just putting in message.payload directly, I'll put message.payload into a JSON-ATA expression. This lets me do simple functions on different values and modify it before it actually gets saved to flow.quantity. Or in this case, it'll be flow.price. So, now that I've selected that JSON-ATA expression value, I'll select these three dots over on the right to make sure I'm doing this correctly. We'll see here I have the ability to insert different functions and test it to make sure it's working. So instead of just using message.payload, I actually want to convert that to a number. So if I bring down all the different functions I have here, we see I do have one just called number. So I'll select that. You can see that I just put the number symbol, then number, and then with parentheses around the argument that I want to turn into a number. So if I type in the $sign and then number, and then I just put in the number, and that in this case is message.payload, and it'll turn whatever I put in as message.payload into a number type. Let's head over to the test tab to check that out. Here we can see hello world isn't going to count as a valid number. But if I, for example, had $5.22, we can see there my output is as expected. You can see it's 5.22 and it's orange instead of green. You'll see if I don't have this function here, and it's just message.payload, we'll see we still get the quotes around it and it's still in green. So we do need to have that number function in there. So that's a really easy way to convert string values into number values, because we do actually have to insert a number as our price into the database so that it matches the column type. So with that done, I'll just click done, and we'll hit done one more time. So there we go. We can now save a product name whenever that gets put in, save a quantity as a integer number, and then save a price as a floating point number that gets converted from that string. We're all set to go. Now we want to add in the rest of these pieces of data and figure out exactly when we want to go through with this checkout process. So to do that, why don't we just add a simple checkout button to this user interface? There's a really nice button gadget at the top here we can just drag right in, and then we'll use this to trigger a function node that is going to get the current date of the time that the button is pressed, and then also we'll be able to insert a customer name in there as well. So let's get started. First, I'll double click my button and put that on the other store items and make it a little bit smaller, let's say only 2 items wide. Now we can give this a button name like checkout. And we'll see down here at the bottom, I could also specify what payload I'm going to send, but this doesn't actually need to send any particular piece of information. Once it gets clicked, it'll insert some message into the flow, and then once that message sets off the function nodes, we'll be able to do the rest from there. So now I'll click done, and we'll first use a function node that I'll just drop in really quickly here to build together an object to make sure all of these properties are coming in the way that I expect them. Once we've got that, then we can come back and insert them into the database. So I'll wire this checkout button into my function node and double click it. Let's start here right at the top with the date. The date is a column that's actually being stored as an integer. It's not a varchar, it's not a string value, so you're not going to see something like Tuesday, May the 4th. You just see a really long number, and that's going to be the representation of the time in Unix time, or the epoch. So I'll first get the time, and I'll do that by doing time_ms, because I am going to be getting in milliseconds, and I'll set that equal to a new date object, and that'll be the date right now that the button has been pressed at, and I'll do get time. You'll see though that this returns it in milliseconds, and my database wants to store them in seconds. So that's a pretty easy conversion though. Because time in milliseconds can just be divided by 1000 to get seconds, I should be good to go. But I do want to make sure it's saved as an integer, not as a floating point value. So if we have a number that falls between 0 and 1000 at the end there, we're going to get a decimal. So let's drop that off with another little function here. This one is just math.round and the result of that division. Now we can just save this as our date and we'll be good to go. So I'll need to be able to reference this date later though, so I'll be putting all of this inside of a message object. So that's just message equal to, then we'll put on some brackets on either side here, and there we go. We have a nice message object that we can return at the end here. Do make sure that you have a colon in between to separate your property title with the actual property value. Next, I'll work down the list and we'll get the product. So the product is going to be that flow.product, but you don't refer to it as flow.product within this context. You have to go and get it from outside of this node. So what you do is flow.get and then hand in the name of what you would like to go get. So flow.get and then quotes around the word product. So now I have that second property, and let's just keep moving down the list. Next we have the quantity, And that'll be very similar. It'll be flow.get quote quantity. And then finally, we just need to get the price. So I'll copy that line and just paste it down below and swap that out. So price is flow.getPrice. Now, the next one on my list is going to be the customer. And you'll notice that both the customer and the product are actually varchars. And these varchars are treated a little bit differently in different database languages. For example, if I say the word product, quote unquote, I could be referring to as this column product, or I could be referring to the value, quote, product, end quote. So in order to help MySQL differentiate whether I'm referring to the column or an actual value, I just put additional quotes in. So instead of it just being, quote, RioDev, which is going to be the customer I'm going to use in this place, I won't just use the literal, quote, RioDev, unquote. I'll hand in extra little tick characters, those single quotes inside the double quotes that you can see there. And these single quotes will be handed into MySQL, and it will then recognize it as a string value rather than something like a command or a title of something like a column or a row. So now that I know that I have that fixed, let's make sure we also put those same ticks around the product at the top here. So instead of trying to put them around it like this, which is going to turn that whole thing into a little string, I'll actually put quotes around those single ticks and add them to the front and back of the string. So here you can see now this whole product value is going to be a single tick, then whatever we store in flow.product, and then a final single tick at the end there. And you'll be able to see that in the debug in just a moment. So we can see now we have message.date, message.product, and so on all the way down. And we'll be able to see these values in the return message in the debug pane in just a second. So I'll give the node a name, something like gather data, and click done. Now I can just drop in a new debug node, but we'll note that I don't have message.payload properties anymore. They're all in different singular message.something properties. So I'll need to make sure I select this dropdown to output the complete message object. So I'll select that, click done, and wire it in. Now we know we're all set to go. I'll go ahead and hit deploy, and we'll come back over to our dashboard. Here we can see we've got our price here, say $3.20. We've got our quantity, let's say we get 3 of them, and we've got our snacks. That's the product we're going to check out with. So I'll go ahead and select checkout, and we'll see back in Node-RED over in the debug pane, I can just drop down this object and there we go. We've got our date right there, that's the timestamp that we were looking for. We've got our product, and you can see it has got that single tick there. Then it says snacks, then it has another single tick, and that whole thing is one value. Quantity is in fact an integer number, price is a decimal, and then we also have those varchar ticks around our customer name as well. This message ID is just used for tracking messages in Node-RED. We can safely ignore it. So we know all of our properties are here successfully. It's time to turn them into an insert statement and see them in the database. To do this, I will be using another function node that I'll just drop in right here. This one is actually going to create the insert statement. This is going to be a lot easier to do now that I've already gathered the data into one nice object. So we'll start by just creating an insert string, and we'll set that equal to insert into the name of the table, that's CStore, and we'll be putting in certain columns. So let's specify which columns those are. So those will be the date column, the product column, the quantity column, the price column, and finally the customer column. And then each of those columns will have one value associated with it, and that's going to be one row. So this insert statement will affect one row each time. So now let's add on the string, continue it on the next line here, so that we can put in what values we're writing. Put parentheses around that, and end with a semicolon as well there. We want to make sure we have the semicolon both inside the quotes to let MySQL know that we're finishing our statement. And we also need to have a semicolon on the outside of the quotes to let JavaScript know that we're finished defining the string. That's why you'll see those both there. So now let's specify the values. Now, these are going to be the same date, product, quantity, price, and customer that we have up here. They're not going to be these string values like date, it's going to be these message properties you can see down here. I can make sure I get it exactly by hovering over it and selecting this button on the left here. You'll see that says copy path. And when I click that, it copies the path to my clipboard. So now I can just insert quotes here and paste that in, and you'll see it is at date. Specifically, it's at message.date. That's not included as part of the path copy. So then I'll just put pluses in, and we'll take this message.date, this number, and we'll put it in the middle of this string here. I could reference more complex objects here. For example, I could have message.payload index0.temperature or something like that. And that's why it comes in really handy to be able to just copy the path there. Because mine are just directly off the message tree, it's pretty easy to just come in here, put quotes around something, add in a plus symbol, and put message dot in there. We'll put the pluses on either side and do the same for the next couple. So there we go. That should be our whole insert statement right there. Now, as you may recall from earlier when we did the subscribe CStore transact request, we do have to send it on message.topic. So we'll set message.topic to be our insert statement. The main thing is it doesn't really matter where this string comes from, whether you read it indirectly, whether you build it in a function node, or whatever else. Once you have that insert statement string, just set it on message.topic and you should be good to go. So now we gather our data and we can create the insert statement and then finally put it into our database. I'll just drop in another MySQL node and wire it in. I will of course be using that same developer database and we're good to go. So now I'll go ahead and click done up in the top right here and we'll see that the database has connected. Before I dive in and actually insert some data into this database, let's have a look and make sure it's empty through the database command line. I've got that open here. We can see here I have a few databases. Dev, MySQL, test, as well as some different schemas. So I first have to make sure that I'm using that dev database. Now that I know I'm using dev, I can say show tables just like I did before, and we'll see, there we go, there's our CStore, which is the one we're going to be checking, and the management we used in a previous example. Now, for example, I can describe CStore, and you'll see we get the exact same description we did before. The ID, that's the primary key, that we have auto-incrementing. Then we have the date, product, quantity, and the other properties and columns that you saw earlier. Now I can do a select everything from this database table. So I'll select star from CStore. Star is just a wildcard that says get everything that matches everything. So when I click enter, we'll see I got an empty set because this table hasn't been used before. So let's insert some data and make sure it's working. So now from Node-RED, I can insert something like snacks and drinks and other purchases, but I want to make sure that the insert statement is working, so I'll also be dropping a debug node over here in the top right. And that'll be looking at the insert statement directly. I know my data gathering is working. So with that done, I'll click deploy and we'll test this out from the dashboard. Let's start by going ahead and doing a checkout with these 3 snacks for $3.20 each. I'll click checkout and that should have done an insert statement. Let's say we want 2 drinks to go with that. I can just come over here, type in drinks, set a different price, say $2.40, and I'll do a checkout of that as well. Now I should have 2 rows affected with 2 very different sets of data. Now, before I trust that this actually worked, I want to go back to Node-RED and check out my debug pane. In fact, we can actually see here I've made some kind of error here. Now, this might seem suddenly really scary because what have I done to the database? But it's okay, if you don't insert a valid statement, MySQL will simply reject it and not do anything with it. You can write out some statements that are correctly written that could damage some data by either changing or removing things that you didn't intend to, but if you do some kind of syntax mistake with the transact SQL, most of the time you're not going to break anything, so don't panic too much. Of course, you should discuss with your database administration, your IT team, and other people in your place of business before using this in any kind of production environment anyway. So make sure you test things out before you put them out there, because things like this happen all the time. Let's find out exactly what went wrong. You can see right here, this red text right here is my insert statement. This is because this is what's representing my message.topic, and you can see that it does have my insert into, and everything looks pretty good. You can see I have my timestamp in there as an integer number, I have my quote snacks end quote, but then here that third field is showing up as undefined. Let's see what went wrong there. If I bring open my code here, we can see we've got the message date, message.product, but it's my message.quantity that's wrong here. We can see here I accidentally missed the T when I was initially typing this out, and it said quante E. And it just needs to have that extra T in there so that it does say quantity. So I'll fix that there and here, and we should be good to go. So I'll go ahead and click done. We'll clear up the debug pane and go ahead and click deploy. We can see we've now reconnected to the database. Let's go back to the dashboard and try to check out once more. I'll also go back and add that quantity 3 snacks. We'll backspace this and turn the price into $3.20 and relabel this as snacks. Now I can check out again and I should have 2 rows this time. Let's go back to Node-RED and here we go. I've inserted 2 values. The reason we're seeing undefined is because we're looking at the message.payload. But we don't care about that, we just care about the topic that gets included whenever we output that to the debug pane. So now I should be able to go back, do a select statement on the database, and I'll see them right there. Let's test that out. I'll do one more select, and there we go. So we can see that we've got our drinks, and then 1 second later, we've got our snacks checkout. With the quantities of 2 and 3, the price of $2.40 and $3.20, and they're both associated with the same customer. Although we could have changed that as well by just adding another text field in our user interface. So it looks like that's working great. We're able to create a flow variable that holds the product name, another one that holds the quantity, another one that holds the price, and then whenever we click a checkout button that exists in the user interface, we gather up all of that data into one single nicely formatted object that it can include some other pieces like the current time or even a customer string. Then we finally build that together into a nice simple insert statement that we put into the developer database and we know it's all working. This is a nice usable flow. In my next example, I'm not going to rely as heavily on the user interface. I'm going to be using physical inputs, and rather than saving them to flow variables and batching them together, I'll get one piece of data after the other and then end up with an object that I can then turn into an insert statement. So the values I'll be using are a fuel level that comes from this potentiometer knob here, as well as this push button which will represent my fuel checkout. I'll be inserting this fuel as a fuel product into this same product database, this C store that I've been using for the rest of the example, and then once I've gone through all that, we'll show how to select it back and display it in that UI page. So let's get started by just cleaning this up really quickly and figuring out what data we need. So with our flow nicely rearranged here, our debug all cleaned up and debug nodes disabled, we're ready to look at the next example. Let's start by figuring out how to read in this push button. I'll be doing that with a groov IO input node. And you can see more about these nodes in a previous video we've done, but the main thing is that whenever I press the button, that will trigger this input. So this could be any other node you would like as well. So I'll double click it, and you'll see I already have a groov IO device configured here, this local host, which is my Rio learning center. I'll select that, and I do want to get a digital state change, that button press. So let's figure out the module index and channel index really quick. I'll head over to my groov manage home and select my IO channels. This is my only module here for the groov Rio, the module index of 0. You can see that up in the top left there in the URL, and we can see I want to grab this bottom button, this digital input on input 1. So if I select that, we can see right now it is off. When I press it down, it momentarily goes on, and when I release, it gets turned off again. So this is the value we want to be reading in right here on index 1. So back in Node-RED, I'll put in my module index of 0, and we'll put in my channel index of 1, and we'll call this read checkout button. Now I'll click done, and we'll test this out. So let's just drop in a debug node really quickly, wire that together, and hit deploy. Now you can see I get a message right away here, I get a false. And you can see that's because I have this send initial value. So if I were to deploy while it's being held down, you would also see a true message. Let's press it now, we'll get the value true, and then when I release, we get the value false. Now, I only want to do one checkout every time the button is pressed, so I actually want to reject all of these false messages. I want to filter those out entirely. So before I move further down into my flow, it's important that I drop in a switch node here. So I can either grab one from the gadget palette on the left, or I can just control click on this wire. That'll bring out this drop down here, and I can just select the switch node, and it wires it in automatically for me. Just a nice way to save some time. I'll select this switch node, and we are checking message.payload for a certain value. But we don't want to see if it's equal to some string, we want to see if it is true. If it is true, it goes output 1, otherwise, it just goes away. So now with that done, I can click deploy, and we'll see I don't get that initial false message. It's being rejected by this switch node. We'll just label it so we can keep track of what it does, is true. So we know that's working. Every time I press the button, we'll get that true message, but when I release it, we don't get the false. One more true, but again, no false. So we're good to go. Let's clear that up and deploy once more. So now that we know our checkout is true, we want to grab that fuel level, that potentiometer. Now, I could have a fuel level input like I do up here where I'm displaying the fuel level. It just scans it for any updates. Whenever it gets updated, it gets rounded down into an integer and displayed in the fuel level. You can see that in the dashboard here, 144 gallons, and then the data just streams out as I turn it up. There we go, it's gone up to 443, and when I turn it back down, it decreases further. So we can just have this data streaming in, but we only want to fetch that value when we're checking out. So instead of using an input node, we instead use a groov IO read node. This requires a message input before it will trigger a read. We'll need to wire this in, having a little trouble dropping it on the wire, and there we go. So now this groov IO read is also going to communicate with the local host device, but instead of getting a digital channel, we're getting an analog channel. Now we just need to find the module index and the channel index of this. So I'll go up into groov manage, and we can see it's on analog input number 2, again on that same module 0. So I'll go back into Node-RED, enter module 0 and channel 2. Now I am going to change this value from a different property other than message.payload. Because I'm going to need to get other pieces of data like the current price per gallon of fuel, I'll need to write that into some property, and if I write it into message.payload, I'll be overwriting this fuel level. So I'll need to save the fuel level to a different property to preserve it as I continue going through this flow. This is a little bit similar to how we saved it to a flow variable, but instead of it being accessible to other nodes in the flow, it's just accessible to nodes further down this flow chain. So we'll see how that looks in a second. Don't worry if it was a bit confusing, it'll all become clear soon. So I'll call this message.fuel, and we'll call this node getFuelLevel. So now we know how much fuel, we just need to know the price. So we'll do that next. So I'll click done, and now we need to get the fuel price. I'll keep this simple for the rest of the example and just drop in a numerical input here. This numerical input is going to be our fuel price. So you'll just simply enter a dollar value, and that'll come in and let us know exactly how much we're getting. So we'll set that to a maximum of, say, 100, and we will put that in the fuel checkout window with a simple width of, say, 4. So now with all of that set, we'll go ahead and click done. We will need to make some other changes in a moment here, but I want you to understand why, so we'll come back to this. The next thing I need to do is make sure all the data is there. Now you can see here, when the value changes, it sends a message.payload, and I can't change this. No matter what I do, it will always overwrite message.payload. It's hard-coded into this node. That's why I couldn't save my fuel level to message.payload. I have to save it to message.fuel so that it doesn't get overwritten. That's what's happening there. Now I can check to make sure all my values are coming through to the end here when I check the complete message object so that I can see that message.fuel and that message.payload here. So let's test this out. I'll go ahead and click deploy, and we'll see that I shouldn't get a value right away. But if I come up into the dashboard and change the fuel price to say $1, I do get a message. The reason for this is this fuel price will send an update every time the value in that field changes. We don't want this. We don't want to do a checkout every single time the fuel price changes. We only want to do a checkout when the button is pressed. So we'll need to write some code in a second to handle that. That's why this method of using one flow to get one piece of data after the other, all attached to the same message payload, can sometimes be a little bit tricky. It's sometimes easier to set them to flow properties that you can then reference all at once in a separate node. But we'll end up seeing at the end of this that it is possible to do it either way. So let's figure out first how we make sure that we're only getting an input when the button is pressed. If I press the button, we'll see the difference in the message payload. So we can see right away, I have a payload of 0, not a payload of 1, and my message.fuel did make it through. So if we get a fuel price, but we don't know how much fuel, we want to reject that message. So that's going to be our first part of code. Let's just control and left click on this wire so that we can drop in a function node. So what we want to do is check to make sure this fuel property even exists by the time we've gotten this far in the flow. So to do that, we'll be checking what's called the type of that message.fuel. If the type of that message.fuel is quote undefined end quote, that means it was never included in the object payload. So I'll put that in parentheses and check if that is true, And if that is true, we just want to return nothing. Return null. This essentially stops the code in its tracks, no more of the code will run, and no message will be returned. It just returns nothingness, it just stops. So now we can do the rest of our code knowing that we're only going to get this far when we have a fuel level and we have a payload. What's important to note here though is that the payload has become 0, and we can see that if we deploy and come up into the dashboard, we can set some fuel price that may be, say, $5 per gallon, but whenever I press this button, it drops the fuel price down to 0 automatically. This is a big problem, and we'll see where that's coming from. So let's see what's happening here. We can see that we're starting by reading the checkout button, then only if it's true will we get the fuel level and save that to message.fuel, and then we enter into the fuel price. So what are we carrying with us when we enter fuel price? Let's check that out by making a copy of a debug node and wiring that into this part of the flow. I'll switch over to my debug pane and click deploy. So we can see now when I press the button and release it, we can see here we've got a payload of true coming out. So we have a payload of the Boolean true that does include our fuel level, but that's going into this fuel price. If I select fuel price and then go to the help tab, we can see here that any input message.payload will be converted to a number, and then if the conversion fails, the minimum number will be taken as the default. Because our minimum fuel price here you can see is 0, when we get an input of true, that can't be converted to a number by this node, so it just defaults to 0, and then that becomes our forced fuel price. So because we're writing in a message.payload into this node, it's actually changing the value that then gets outputted. This is really easy to work around though, because we don't care about this message.payload anymore. We know it's true, we know we're doing a checkout, so before we even get into this node, let's just delete it. So we'll drag these out of the way, and we'll drop in a change node right here. This change node, instead of setting message.payload, we'll just delete it. So now, let's go through this flow one more time. First, we're reading the checkout button. If that's true, we'll collect the fuel level and save that to its own message property. Then we delete the payload that we picked up earlier and go ahead and grab the fuel price, which now is not going to be damaged by any incoming information. Then we'll go into the function node, make sure that we do in fact have our fuel level, and we'll see it all right here in this final debug node. Let's clear up the debug pane, deploy, and test this out. I'll go over to the dashboard and set some fuel price, say $3, and we'll see as soon as I press the button and release it, our fuel price has not changed. And if I go back into Node-RED, we can see we haven't gotten any errors and we do still have our payload of 3. That's going to be our fuel price. You can see that's unchanged right there under the node. So now we successfully have our fuel quantity and our fuel payload. That's our fuel price. Now it's finally time for us to create our insert statement. Let's move these over and start editing this function node a little bit more. We'll start the same place we did with the last example, by getting the current time in milliseconds, and that's going to be our Unix timestamp that we're going to then convert into seconds and save as our date. So I'll set that timestamp equal to a new date object that's for the current time right now that that button is pressed, and we'll do getTime to get the time in milliseconds. Then to get the time in seconds, which will be our date property, we'll do time underscore milliseconds and divide it by 1000. Again, because this field is an integer, we will need to use the math library to round that down to just an integer number. I won't be saving it to a message property this time, although you could. I'll just be creating this whole insert statement right here in this one node. Next, I need to set what my product name is. In this case, that'll be the string, quote, fuel, end quote. And of course, because this is a varchar, I will need to put those single ticks inside those quotes so that MySQL knows how to interpret it. The next thing is going to be the quantity, and that's the amount of fuel I'm getting, so that'll be the message.fuel that I read in earlier. And I also need to know the price, and that will be the current message.payload. You can see that's my price there, that $3 on my message.payload. Finally, I'll set the customer name, and that will be, quote, Rio-dev, end quote, and again with a semicolon after that. And now we can put all this into the insert statement. So I'll do the same thing I did last time where I say insert equals, quote, insert into CStore. Then we'll specify the columns that we're inserting into. Then we'll add on a new string, create a new line, and we'll determine exactly which values we're writing. Again, I will need a semicolon inside the quotes, and that's what gets sent to MySQL to let it know that the statement is over. And we'll also have a semicolon on the outside to let JavaScript know that this string here that we're constructing is over. The two of them both need to be there, it's very important. So now, inserting into my C-store, I will have my date, the product name, my quantity, and let's make sure we spell that correctly, and the price, as well as the customer. So these are, of course, the names of the columns I'm putting in, and the values aren't going to be the strings of those columns. I need to actually make sure these are individual message properties. So I'll put quotes around date, and I don't need to refer to it as message.date, since it's just a local variable that I have within JavaScript. You don't have to do this, but if you'd like, you can put the word var before them just so that you know that they all exist locally. We're creating these and we can't reference them anywhere else in the flow, but we're just fine referencing them like this inside this code block. We also have our product, quantity, price, and finally the customer. I'm just double clicking it, pushing quotes to force that character outside of the quotes, and then putting plus signs on either side. So we get this values string, then we add inside the whatever value is this current date, then we add in a comma character, then we add in the product, and so on, going down until create the entire insert statement. We'll of course have to save this to message.topic since that's where the MySQL node looks for that insert statement, so we'll just set that right there and go ahead and click done. I'm not going to drag in the developer database node just yet. I want to actually see this insert statement first. So I'll click deploy, and we'll reach over and press our button. Here right away, we can see we've got this insert topic at the top here, and we can also see it in the main body here. Insert into C-store, we've got the date, the product, the quantity, price, and customer, and each of the values are well defined. We should be good to insert this into the database. I'll just make a copy of this database node here and paste this at the bottom and wire it in. So with that all set up, we can go ahead and click deploy, and I'll bring back open my database command line and confirm that we still have those same two rows there. Yep, looks like we're good to go. If I bring back open Node-RED and select some fuel level and press the checkout button, we can see there we go, we've injected a message and we've gotten an OK from the developer database node. So if I now switch back and do the select again, there we go. We've got a fuel entry where we've gotten 63 gallons at $3 a gallon, and you can see the product there is fuel. So if I were to increase that quantity a little bit, say we're filling up a large truck, push that button once more, and release. If I do another select, there we go. We can see we've got another fuel checkout where the number did increase to 127 gallons. Let's do one final test where we change the price. Say we're in California and price has gone up over the summer, it's $5, and we're getting a lot of it this time. We'll get 251 gallons. Now I'll press that checkout button and release. You can see our fuel price is unchanged. We have another inject statement over here, and if I switch back to that command line and select once more, we have a third checkout, and here we're getting 251 gallons at $5 per gallon. So there we go. Now we've got all of our drinks and our snacks and our fuel, all that we can see right here in this database. Now, I may not just want to see it in the database though. If I don't have access to the command line or I'm not an administrator or something like that, I would never know what was in there and whether or not it was a successful purchase. So let's quickly finish this up by creating a table in the dashboard and displaying all of this data through that table. So, in order to display this data, which comes in as a table, we'll first need to bring it into Node-RED, and then we'll also need a new gadget that we can actually use to display it. Let's first start by selecting some data and see what format it looks like in the debug pane. And in order to read in that data, we can just reuse this top little flow at the top here. But instead of asking it to describe C-store or show what's inside of some kind of database, we'll just do select star from C-store, just like we did in the developer command line. So I'll go ahead and click done, click deploy, and we'll hit inject on this top flow. Here we can see it returned an array of objects. Each object represents one row, and each of the properties is the columns that make up that row. So we've got our date, product, quantity, price, and customer, just like we injected earlier. And we'll see the same for the other objects, including the fuel that we just added. So we have this really nicely structured data here, we just need to display it in some kind of table. Now, in order to display this data in a nice table, we will need to add a new node to our palette, because you'll notice under the UI dashboard nodes, there are none designed for a table. Thankfully, we can just install one new package, but you will need a gateway to the internet to do so. Because I'm here connected to the internet over my local router, I can just come up here into the top right, select Manage Palette, and then search for the node under the Install tab. So all I have to type in is UI-table, and we'll see it's this top single result here, Node-RED-UI-table. So I'll go ahead and install that, confirm the installation, and then I can view the log to make sure it comes down correctly. Depending on the version of Node-RED that you're using and the version of the Node-RED UI table nodes, you may see some errors here, but as long as you get a return code of 0 and see the nodes show up in your palette, you should be good to go. And there we go. After just a couple of seconds of waiting, we've got that return code of 0 at the bottom, and we'll see the green pop-up showing that the UI table is added at the top. I'll close out of all of these windows, and if I scroll down, we can see it right there. There's the table node. So let's drag this in and figure out exactly how it works. If I select that, and then come over to the Help tab, we can see that a Node-RED dashboard UI widget node displays a table of data. And all it has to have is an array of objects which contain row data, which is exactly what we're reading in, so it's perfect for this application. We don't need to worry about the outputs, we're just going to be writing to it. So let's double click the node and configure it. We'll start by adding a new group for this, since it's not really part of the full checkout and it's not part of the purchasing of other store items. So I'll select Add New UI Group and select the pencil icon and just call this group Display Data. So I'll keep this in the same Home tab, and I'll give it a nice wide width of say 12 units. Now I'll go ahead and select Add, and we can see we've got this Display Data group selected here, and we will make sure that we max that out by also selecting 12 for the size here. Now I just need to give this node a name like Display Table, and so now we just need to set what our columns are, and we can do that by just coming back over to the debug pane, and there they all are. So I'll select this little add button in the bottom left hand corner under columns, and we can see we can name exactly what property it is, what the title should be, and where we're aligning this. So because it's coming off message.payload, we know it'll be message.payload 0.date, 1.product, and etc. So because the data has to come in on message.payload as was described in the node settings right here, we know that we are getting all of this row data, we just need to determine which properties within that individual row make up a column. So the column property name ID is one of those properties. So I can just do this and call this the entry number, since that's what it represents. Now I'll click in and add, and we'll just work our way down the list here. The next one we have after the ID is the date, and we can title that the same. We'll do another one for our product. Copy and paste that. We'll have another property, and that's going to be our quantity. Add one more for our price, and add our final customer property. And we'll be able to see all of this data really nice and easily. So now all I have to do is click Done, wire that directly into the output of the developer node, since that's what's outputting this message.payload, and I can go ahead and click Deploy. So now we'll see I have my table here. It shouldn't have anything in it because I haven't done any select statements. If I bring open the dashboard, you can see there are all the properties I just added, but none of them have any data below them yet. So let's go back, inject right here on our developer database, and when I come back, there we go. It's nicely populated with data. I can scroll down and see that all here. I can make this table a little bit bigger by double clicking it and increasing the size so that it's a bit longer, let's say 12 by 6. And when I click deploy, this is a really easy way to get started. It's really convenient, and the UI table node makes it dead easy to display a large amount of data from one single array here in the Node-RED UI dashboard. If you have any questions about how any of this works, check out our other videos, check out our forums that'll be linked in the description, or feel free to leave a comment on this video. Thanks for watching.